It was a vast place, and one had to admit, an impressive one. For some inexplicable reason, the modern exterior hid an interior styled like an old baronial castle, reminiscent of those lavish sets you sometimes see in movies. Essentially, it was a Victorian interpretation of the perfect medieval castle. In fact, in the good old days, they didn't have the technology to build such large and extravagant buildings. One thing I knew for sure was that the wedding would not have taken place in such a venue if I had paid the bill. But my ex-wife Shauna had made sure that didn't happen years before. I thought I had found a safe hiding place, tucked away in the pseudo-minstrel's gallery, which served as both a spotlight tower and a projection room. From there, I could watch the ceremony but not be seen by anyone on the floor of the main hall below. I was well aware that my presence, if made known, would prove controversial, to say the least, and would likely lead to an unpleasant confrontation between me and my former in-laws. Besides, I was sure my daughter would not be thrilled if it happened. I even assumed that Tamsin would be even less pleased to learn of my presence than Witch and George, her crony husband. Anyway, I was sitting in silence, lurking at the back of the minstrel's gallery, from where I could watch the wedding of my estranged daughter, when suddenly a voice whispered right into my ear. "Hey, handsome, I thought you wouldn't miss this little celebration." To say that the sound of that voice made me wince is an understatement. I literally jumped off the fishing stool I was sitting on and collapsed to the floor. Well, yes, if I had been sitting on that little stool and watching the service through the bars of the balustrade, I would have thought there was less chance of anyone noticing me. The rumble that the small aluminum stool made as it fell to the stone floor of the minstrel's gallery and then drove across it had to be seen to be believed. I realized that any chance of my presence remaining secret had instantly evaporated. From my new position, lying on my back on the floor, I looked up and saw trouble towering over me. My daughter's aunt, looking very embarrassed, was making frantic apologetic hand gestures toward the hall below. Megan, or Trouble as I jokingly nicknamed her in my younger days, was, or rather had been, my ex-wife's mischievous younger sister. Megan was often the bane of our courtship. As I glanced between the bars of the balustrade, I saw the curious glances from below, and I knew that the ruckus I had caused had drawn unwanted attention. Megan crouched down next to me, her face a mixture of guilt and amusement. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you like that," she whispered. "Great timing, as always," I muttered, getting to my feet and dusting myself off. "What are you doing here, Megan?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "But I suppose it's obvious. You're here to see Tamsin." "Yes, but I didn't want to make a scene," I said, casting a wary glance at the hall below where the wedding guests were starting to settle down again. Megan chuckled softly. "Well, you might have failed on that front, but don't worry, I'll cover for you. Just stay low and try not to draw any more attention to yourself." "Thanks," I said, genuinely grateful. Despite her knack for causing trouble, Megan had always had a good heart. As the ceremony continued, I managed to stay out of sight, thanks to Megan's intervention. Watching Tamsin from afar, I felt a pang of regret and sadness. But at least I was there, witnessing a significant moment in her life, even if it was from the shadows. After the ceremony, as the guests started to file out, Megan gave me a quick hug. "Take care, handsome, and don't be a stranger. Tamsin needs you, even if she doesn't realize it yet." I nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. As I slipped out of the gallery and made my way out of the castle-like venue, I knew I had made the right decision to come. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward mending the fractured relationship with my daughter. I realized that my hiding place had suddenly become the center of attention for almost everyone in the building. The bride, groom, celebrant, photographer, choir, cameraman, and most of the congregation were all looking at Megan with annoyed and somewhat puzzled expressions on their faces. I pressed myself as hard as I could against the floor and prayed that no one else would notice me. Megan, signaling that the service was in progress, picked up my little stool and delicately lowered herself onto it. From my reclining position, I could no longer see the floor of the main hall, but I could almost hear what was going on downstairs. Soon, I realized that the wedding service had resumed. I hoped the incident had been written off as one of Megan's tricks. Megan's penchant for unusual behaviors and surprises was legendary in the family, even when she was a child. "It's okay, you can watch now," Megan whispered. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you jump, Billy." "Make me jump, woman? You damn near gave me a heart attack." "Where did you learn to sneak around like that, Megan?" I whispered, maneuvering myself into a position from which I could observe what was happening below. It became clear to me that I had temporarily lost the use of my little stool. "Oh, I kind of picked that up as a kid, sneaking up on a couple of familiar lovers." She lowered her gaze and winked at me. "You cheeky little monkey. I'm not so little anymore, Billy boy. Just watch your step, or you might find yourself in trouble later." "Oh no, I won't, Megan. I'm on the next train out of this place as soon as the ceremony is over." Megan looked down at me again, made a strange but oddly familiar gesture with her eyes that I interpreted as, "That's what you think," and then made a hand gesture toward the set below, letting me know that the conversation was cut off until the ceremony was over. I always liked Shauna's little sister. Sure, sometimes she was a real pain in the ass when Shauna and I were courting, but Shauna was always less tolerant of Trouble's antics than I was. Megan always struck me as a good-hearted kid who needed attention. There was a good 4 years between the two sisters, a recipe for discord like never before. I always thought Megan just didn't realize that her older sister, and me included, needed a little privacy from time to time. The service was over, and I tried my best to get a good look at the groom as he led Tamsin out of the hall. Not that the angle made it an easy task if I was going to stay out of sight. As far as I could judge, the guy seemed like a decent enough person. He had a confident air about him and a warm smile that seemed to put Tamsin at ease. As they walked down the aisle, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Pride for my daughter who looked radiant and happy, sadness for the lost years and the distance between us, and a glimmer of hope that maybe this was the start of something new, a chance to rebuild bridges. Megan nudged me with her elbow. "See? It's not so bad, is it?" she whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I watched Tamsin and her new husband greet their guests, I knew that this was a day I wouldn't forget. And maybe, just maybe, it was a day that would lead to better things. After the ceremony, as the guests started to move towards the reception area, Megan helped me slip out of the gallery unnoticed. She gave me a quick hug. "Take care, Billy, and don't be a stranger. Tamsin might not show it, but she needs you." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. As I walked away from the castle-like venue, I knew I had made the right decision to come. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of mending the fractured relationship with my daughter. Thankfully, everyone was so focused on the bride and groom that I don't think anyone even glanced at the minstrel gallery. But as soon as the motorcade was out of sight below us, Megan started trying to drag me to my feet. "Come on, Billy, we'd better get down to the dining room," she urged. I resisted Megan's fierce tugging on my arm, trying to stay out of sight until all the guests had left the room. "There's no way in hell I'm showing up at this party." "Oh my God, I'm going to jail," I groaned. "Don't talk nonsense, Billy. It's your own daughter's wedding," she snapped. "Why would the police arrest you?" "Well, there's that bleeding restraining order for starters," I muttered. "No, Billy, Shauna is already dead, and she's the only person listed on the restraining order. When he killed her, that order immediately became null and void." "What do you mean he killed her?" I demanded, almost jumping to my feet. "It was an accident, wasn't it?" "Billy, that bloody moron has always driven like a bloody idiot, and he still does. That weirdo is a disaster waiting to happen every time he gets behind the damn wheel. Do you have any idea how fast he was going that day?" "I know very little about it, Megan. I saw the skid marks on the road, Billy. He drove like a bloodthirsty idiot that night, just like he always does. I just can't understand how he hasn't been prosecuted for my sister's murder. Even Tamsin knows who's responsible for her mother's death. You may have noticed he wasn't there tonight. He wasn't invited." I sighed deeply. "Me too, Megan. Yes, you were, in a way. I just couldn't find you to let you know. Look, my invitation says." She pulled out a card and pointed to it. "Missy, Megan Stone, and a guest. No reservations or anything. Guess who's going to be my guest?" I laughed out loud. "You've got to be kidding me, Megan. Me showing up at Stone's wedding? Been there once, remember my girl? And you remember how that turned out in the end? How the fact that my sister was a stupid cow has nothing to do with it, Billy. You're Tamsin's father, and— She paused, her voice softening. Christ, you were supposed to be there today, giving her away in marriage, not her grandfather. I shook my head, feeling a mix of regret and frustration. Megan, I didn't think it was right. I didn't think she'd want me there. She squeezed my arm, her eyes sincere. Billy, Tamsin may have her issues with you, but deep down, she wanted her dad there. You being absent was a bigger statement than you think. I sighed, letting the weight of her words sink in. Maybe you're right, Megan. Maybe I should have been there. Damn right you should have, she replied firmly. Now let's get down to that dining room before we miss the toast. Reluctantly, I allowed her to pull me up. As we made our way down to the dining room, I couldn't help but think about all the missed opportunities and the chances I had to make things right with my daughter. Maybe today was a step in the right direction, even if it had started with a stumble. As we entered the dining room, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. I spotted Tamsin across the room, her face glowing with happiness. Megan gave me a gentle nudge. Go on, Billy. Make your presence known. It's never too late to be a part of her life. Taking a deep breath, I walked towards my daughter, determined to make amends and be the father she deserved. The journey might be long, but I was ready to take the first step. Now you and I are going to the reception together, and I don't want to hear any nonsense about restraining orders, Megan insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. My Uncle Albert assures me that there is no legitimate reason why you should not attend the reception as my guest. What's more, he thinks it's a damn good idea. He's always been in your camp, even when things went wrong. And here I was wondering why that old bastard doesn't represent Shauna, I commented wryly. Look, Billy, if my Uncle Albert thought he could get away with it, I'm damn sure he'd represent you for free. He was totally unimpressed with my sister's behavior back in the day and took a real hard line on her and my mom and dad. He outright refused to represent Shauna. As far as I know, he and my mother haven't spoken two polite words to each other since. The only time I ever saw them in the same room together was at Shauna's funeral. I think Uncle Albert was a little disappointed that you didn't show up that day. I wasn't even in the country, Megan. I was helping a team filming the fauna and flora on South Georgia ever since those people got trapped there when the Argentines invaded. They preferred us to stay off the ship if possible. Anyway, I didn't know anything about Shauna's accident until 3 months after her funeral when we returned to the UK. I met Toby What's-His-Name in Falmouth, and he told me about the accident. While I listened to Megan's explanation, she lifted me to my feet and started dusting off my suit. No, that's my costume. God, some people's minds, I ask you, I muttered. Come on, Billy, Megan continued, ignoring my grumbling. Let's go down to the front desk before the line for the reception dissipates. The way Megan gripped my hand tightly made it clear that, whether I liked the idea or not, she had decided I was attending my daughter's wedding reception. Against my better judgment, I admitted defeat. I had to concede that it was probably due to the considerable amount of alcohol I had consumed in the previous 24 hours, clouding my judgment enough for me to give in to Megan's desires. Yeah, look, I'd better explain. When Shauna and I first broke up, I have to admit that I didn't handle the situation as well as I could have. I ended up spending more than a few days visiting American authorities or local law enforcement anyway, when I took it upon myself to exact a little retribution. Megan squeezed my hand tighter and nodded sympathetically. I remember, Billy. Those were tough times. But that's in the past now, and today is about Tamsin. She needs you there, whether she realizes it or not. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. All right, Megan, let's do this. As we made our way to the reception, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of anxiety and determination. The lavish castle-like venue, with its Victorian interpretation of a medieval castle, felt surreal. The grandeur of the place only added to my sense of unease, but seeing Megan's unwavering support gave me the strength to face whatever was ahead. When we arrived at the reception area, the room was filled with the buzz of conversation and laughter. I spotted Tamsin across the room, looking radiant and happy. Megan nudged me gently. Go on, Billy, make your presence known. Taking another deep breath, I walked towards my daughter, determined to make amends and be the father she deserved. This might be the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild the bridges that had been burned. As I approached her, Tamsin turned and our eyes met. There was a moment of hesitation before she smiled, and in that smile, I saw a glimmer of hope. I gave the new man in Shauna's life a little reprimand. It might have been a frivolous and somewhat enjoyable endeavor at the time, but in the long run, it proved to be very misguided. The confrontation didn't end the way I expected, and as a result, I received a thorough kick in the ass. Unfortunately, Shauna somehow got caught up in the mess, which led to her being rushed to the nearest ambulance, what the Yanks like to call them. Hence, my incarceration and the numerous court orders issued in both the US and the UK forbidding me from coming closer than a mile or so to Shauna's whereabouts, permanently or almost permanently. I can assure you, dear reader, that I have never laid a finger on my unfaithful wife. Well, to the best of my knowledge, not once. This statement will probably become clearer to you later, I'm sure. Where was I? Oh yeah, after the court had had its way with me, I was labeled an ex-convict, as the Yanks like to call us, and branded a bully and a wife-beater. After the fight, I was unceremoniously stripped of my parental rights to our daughter, Tamsin. Almost all of this happened while I was still in an American prison, by the way. Not a pleasant experience, I assure you. At that time in my life, nothing was fun at all. The label of an ex-convict did not help my career much either. Try getting a work visa to the United States with such a record. However, none of this stopped Shauna, with the assistance of the British legal system, from demanding that I provide financial support for Tamsin until she turned 18. I'm not very proud of what I have to admit next. After the system kicked my ass so effectively, I took solace in drinking for a while. However, I managed not to turn into a complete wreck or a hardened alcoholic. That was probably due to inherited biological traits rather than any kind of mental fortitude, if you know what I mean. Nevertheless, I still needed something to help me face the day in the best possible way. Are you still working in the movie industry, Billy? Asked Megan, leading a somewhat unsure me as we slowly made our way forward, up the stairs to the main lobby of the establishment. No, not really, Megan, I replied. I guess you could say I'm in the shipping business now. Most of the time, I work as a sailor on research vessels and the like, though I do shoot quite a bit. I suppose it's handy for them to have a backup or second experienced cameraman on the crew to help document what's going on. Sometimes I'm the only cameraman on board. So you've given up on Hollywood? Megan inquired. Megan, I've never worked for any of the big guys, I said, shaking my head. I've always been more of an independent, floating around wherever the work takes me. Hollywood was never really my scene. Megan chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Well, you always did like to blaze your own trail, Billy. I couldn't help but smile at that. Yeah, I suppose I did. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. And sometimes being out at sea gives you a lot of time to think and reflect. Reflect on what? She asked, genuinely curious. On everything, I replied, my voice softening. On the mistakes I've made, the people I've hurt, and the things I want to do differently moving forward. Megan nodded, her expression thoughtful. Well, it sounds like you found a way to make peace with your past. That's more than most people can say. Yeah, maybe, I said, feeling a weight lift slightly from my shoulders. But being here today, seeing Tamsin get married, it's brought a lot of things back to the surface. That's understandable, Megan said, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. But remember, you're here now. You're a part of her life, and that's what matters. I took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of determination. You're right, Megan. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. As we reached the main lobby, the sounds of laughter and music filled the air, and I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. This was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild and make things right. And with Megan by my side, I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. The most I've ever managed was as a second-string cameraman, I admitted, and on some pretty mediocre, third-rate movies at that. Unfortunately for me, Shauna was much more successful with directors and producers than I ever was. Shauna always wanted to be a star, Billy, Megan reminded me. You knew that before you even married her. Yeah, but I had no idea how far she'd go to realize her dream, I said, shaking my head. Hell, look at this pile. We found ourselves in the grand lobby of the hotel, which we had to navigate to reach the entrance to the function room where Tamsin's wedding reception was being held. The vast space was filled with guests patiently waiting in line for the official reception line. I figured the witch, Megan and Shauna's mother, had planned the show and put her best foot forward. The witch had an even bigger megalomania than my ex-wife ever did. She planned and organized our wedding too, even though it wasn't on the same scale as this celebration. I should add that the witch and I have never been members of each other's respective fan clubs, so I assumed that my appearance at this reception might go disastrously awry. Finding myself anonymously in the crowd no longer made me feel so vulnerable. Though more than one of the guests' relatives quickly interjected, recognizing me, probably from Shauna's wedding and my own years before. I also knew that I had a few allies out there somewhere, but they would be kept a closely guarded secret. The Stones were actually a pretty tight-knit clan. Eventually, the crowd began to thin, and the witch finally spotted me from her seat a little farther back from the receiving line. Her face instantly turned crimson, and for a moment I thought I saw smoke coming out of her ears. Although I protested, Megan dragged me through the entrance to the conference room and to the front of the reception line. Tamsin's new husband was momentarily stunned when Megan introduced me as her fiancé's father. The poor man didn't know what to do or say. I shook his very weak hand. Tamsin was just as shocked, if not more so. As I stared into her eyes, they grew larger and larger, and I feared they were about to pop out of her skull. You know, I really think the kid had no idea who I was until he heard Aunt Megan inform her new spouse that I was Tamsin's father. For some inexplicable reason, I decided to break the ice with a bit of humor. Hey, baby, it's been a while since I've had the pleasure of embarrassing you in front of a crowd, I said with a wink. Tamsin blinked, a mix of emotions crossing her face before she finally let out a small, reluctant laugh. Dad, you never change, she said, shaking her head. Wouldn't dream of it, I replied, feeling a strange mix of pride and regret. This was a moment I hadn't been sure I'd ever experience, and now that I was here, I was determined to make the most of it. As we moved further into the reception, I felt the tension begin to ease. Megan stayed close by, her presence a reassuring anchor in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Despite the initial shock, I could see that Tamsin was warming up to having me there. She introduced me to her friends, who seemed both curious and cautious about the man who had been a ghost in her life for so long. The reception was in full swing, and I was doing my best to navigate the social intricacies of the event. I even managed to exchange a few polite words with the witch, though the glare she shot me could have curdled milk. Megan's mischievous grin told me she was enjoying the spectacle far more than she let on. At one point, Tamsin pulled me aside, away from the crowd. Dad, she began, her voice soft, I never expected you to come today. I didn't even know if you knew about the wedding. Megan made sure I knew, I replied, glancing over at her with a grateful nod. And I wouldn't have missed it for the world, Tamsin. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I'm glad you're here. It means a lot to me. Me too, sweetheart, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. Me too. As the night wore on, I felt a sense of closure begin to settle over me. This was a new chapter, not just for Tamsin and her new husband, but for me as well. I had a long way to go to rebuild the bridges I'd burned, but being there, surrounded by family, both old and new, felt like a good start. Megan sidled up to me, a glass of champagne in hand. See, Billy, it wasn't so bad after all, she said, clinking her glass against mine. No, it wasn't, I agreed, raising my glass in a toast. To new beginnings and old friends. And to trouble, Megan added with a wink. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. To trouble, I echoed, knowing that with Megan by my side, I could face whatever came next. Before I took her outstretched hand and kissed the back of it, I hesitated. Yeah, I thought about hugging Tamsin, but I was afraid she might faint if I did. Tamsin's response boiled down to, but, until Megan nudged me with her elbow. The next face that caught my eye was Witch's buddy George. He recognized me and handled the situation quite well. Well, I thought so. William, we weren't, well, this is an unexpected surprise. How did you? Billy is my guest, Dad. If he goes, I go, commanded Megan, sitting down next to me. I wondered if Megan had talked to Tamsin. It seemed to me that there just wasn't time. I wouldn't assume that for a second, Megan, the old lady replied. Of course William is welcome here. I was just surprised he was in the country. Your mother assured me he was working somewhere on the Antipodes right now. I worked in Antarctica, sir. I have no idea why I addressed the bastard as sir. Probably habit. My ship docked in New Zealand 5 weeks ago, I informed the old man. You see, Megan, your mother has been trying to contact William. You got her message, I assume, William. Your mother told you she would contact William, Megan. You are very welcome here today, my boy. George shifted his attention from me to Megan as he spoke. Whatever he said, I was sure there was no message. In the age of modern electronic communication, things are pretty good out there. Only occasionally interrupted by extremely bad weather on the coastal base. So despite all the old man's assurances to the contrary, I was certain that I had never been included on the guest list, even tentatively. The fact that my ex-mother-in-law had disappeared from the waiting list by the time we got to her house convinced me of that. I even wondered if she'd rushed off to call the police or something. Tamsin's new relatives were polite and pleasant, and obviously very confused. They didn't look like they'd seen a ghost. Better to say they were shocked to find themselves shaking hands with one of them. It was all pretty funny from my point of view, but it made me wonder what exactly they had been told about Tamsin's father. Most of the other guests had no idea who I was, so we were looked at rather curiously, probably to see why Megan had decided to watch the wedding ceremony from the minstrel gallery as we left the reception hall. Like everyone else, I took a glass of bubbly from a passing waitress and drank it in one gulp. Megan explicitly told me to slow down as I picked up the second glass. Then the imposing figure of Sir Albert Stone appeared through the crowd. His presence was commanding, and his eyes immediately locked onto mine. "Billy, my boy, what a surprise to see you here," he boomed, his voice full of unexpected warmth. "Sir Albert," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Megan convinced me it was a good idea to come. And a good idea it was, he agreed, his gaze softening. Family is family, after all. Indeed, I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and anxiety. This man had always been a rock, a steady force, even when the rest of the world seemed determined to knock me down. As we stood there, Megan excused herself to mingle, leaving me alone with Sir Albert. "So, how's life treating you these days?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Can't complain," I said with a half smile. "Still doing a lot of traveling for work. Keeps me busy." "Good to hear," he said, nodding approvingly. "You always were a wanderer, Billy, but it's good to see you back, even if just for a while." "It's good to be back," I admitted, glancing around the room, "though it feels a bit surreal." He chuckled. "Life often does, especially at weddings. Just take it one step at a time." We continued chatting, catching up on years of lost time. It felt oddly comforting, a moment of normalcy in the whirlwind of emotions that surrounded me. Eventually, Megan returned, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Ready to face the music, Billy?" she asked with a grin. "Always," I replied, feeling a renewed sense of determination. With Sir Albert's support and Megan's unwavering confidence, I felt ready to tackle whatever came next. As we moved through the crowd, mingling and exchanging pleasantries, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could find a place in this new chapter of Tamsin's life. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but I was willing to try. For now, that was enough. I even wondered why Uncle Albert had not been included among the guests, for he was the patriarch of the whole damn clan. "William, my boy, how nice to see you here today." "Hyacinth, the witch, made me believe you were abroad and unable to attend," said Albert, holding out his hand for me to shake. "I can't say I've always liked the old git. Megan's Uncle Albert is a barrister by vocation, and he always seemed too formal for my liking. In my youth, I had a natural aversion to his type, an aversion which has since been somewhat strengthened by my encounters with members of the legal profession. However, Megan hinted that this old geezer had sided with me during the collapse of my marriage. As a result, I was forced to do a quick reassessment of my feelings for this character. "How do you do, sir?" I replied, shaking his hand. "It's nice to meet you again." Capital, capital, Albert grinned back. I'm not quite sure what the phrase capital, capital, capital is supposed to mean or imply, but I know from memory that it was Uncle Albert's usual response to almost anything and everything that was ever said to him. Provided everything went the way the old bone setter would have liked, that is. At this point, Tamsin appeared in front of me. Her duties on the receiving line had obviously been completed. In fact, completely oblivious to her manners, Tamsin rather rudely elbowed her way between Uncle Albert and me. The expression on Tamsin's face I can only describe as one of sheer disgust. You don't have everyone at home here. What, do you want to get some handout or something, or do you just want to embarrass me? Demanded Tamsin, though surprisingly quiet. I suppose I should point out that Tamsin's words, and the way she said them, were taken straight from the witch's repertoire. It wasn't my daughter speaking to me. It was Tamsin who had been brainwashed by the witch since she was born. The realization of that fact disappointed me, but I didn't take offense at Tamsin's attitude toward me. It only reassured me that everything was as I had expected. I shifted my gaze from my daughter to Albert and then to Megan standing next to me. I told you this was a bad idea, Megan. I better leave, I said and turned to leave. No, wait a minute, young man, exclaimed Albert, loud enough to get the attention of almost everyone standing nearby, and imperious enough to make me stop instantly. I turned around wondering what the old man would say. Albert's eyes twinkled with a blend of authority and kindness. William, you are not leaving this reception. Not now, not ever. You are Tamsin's father, and you have every right to be here. I won't have any of this nonsense. Tamsin looked taken aback, her indignation momentarily faltering under the weight of Albert's words. Megan stood firm beside me, her expression one of determination and support. Uncle Albert is right, Megan added, her voice steady. Billy has every right to be here, and it's high time we put the past behind us and acted like a family. Tamsin glanced between us, her anger slowly dissipating into confusion and perhaps even a touch of remorse. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something she couldn't quite find. I stepped forward, my voice calm but resolute. Tamsin, I'm not here to embarrass you or ask for anything. I just want to be a part of your life again, if you'll let me. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Tamsin's eyes softened, and she gave a small, hesitant nod. All right, Dad, she said quietly. You can stay. A wave of relief washed over me as the tension in the room began to dissipate. Albert clapped me on the shoulder, a proud smile on his face. That's more like it, he said. Now, let's enjoy this celebration as a family should. Megan linked her arm with mine, leading me back into the throng of guests. The room slowly returned to its festive atmosphere, the earlier drama fading into the background. As I mingled with the guests, I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about the future. Tamsin, your father traveled almost halfway around the world to be here with you on this special day for you. The least you can do is be civil to him. Actually, Albert's statement isn't entirely true. I almost always spent the summer months in the UK. Most of my ship and natural history work took place in Antarctic waters, but there's not much going on there at this time of year. My daughter looked puzzled, her brow furrowing as she tried to process everything. She shifted her gaze from me to Albert, then to everyone watching, and back to me again. I'm sorry, Father, she said finally. Your unexpected presence took me by surprise. You have never shown any interest in my life. And where did you get that idea from, Tamsin? Albert roared, his voice echoing through the room. I must tell you, young lady, that your father has watched your development very closely. He has risked arrest on more than one occasion to witness the important events in your life. Isn't that right, young man? I'm sorry, sir, I started to reply, but Albert, unprompted, continued talking. Prize giving at that bloody, stupid, expensive school your mother insisted on sending you to. I am reliably informed that your father attended every one of them. He was also at your graduation from university. Damn it, girl. You walked past your father to get your diploma without even noticing him. He knew who you were, but you didn't recognize him. Don't forget your mother did too, and that may have saved your father from a visit to the local magistrate's court. I didn't know you were there, Uncle Albert, Tamsin said, taking a chance. I wasn't, Tamsin. At any rate, not as regularly as I would have liked. Your mother and I had our differences, you know that. But I have people who have been watching your development all these years, and they might have recognized your father. And none of them could have accidentally broken your father's cover, could they? When your mother was around, your father's presence was technically illegal. I would advise you, Tamsin, to smile sweetly and forget about your supposed disagreement with your father. I assure you he, or rather your father's reputation in your eyes, has always been a victim of circumstance, coupled with your late mother's extremely poor judgment. Let's call a family truce on this special day, shall we? By this time, my daughter was looking pretty sheepish. If you insist, Uncle, Tamsin agreed, then added, but I wonder what his motivation is for coming here today. Tamsin turned her back to me and disappeared into the crowd. My heart sank a bit as I watched her retreating figure. I had hoped for a warmer reception, but I knew it would take time for the wounds to heal. Megan touched my arm gently, offering silent support. Albert cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to him. Give her time, William, he said softly. She's been fed lies for years. It won't change overnight. I nodded, appreciating his words. Thank you, Albert. I appreciate everything you've done. He patted my shoulder firmly. We'll get through this, William. Just be patient and show her the love she deserves. She'll come around. I sighed deeply, taking in the scene around me. Guests were mingling, laughter and chatter filling the air. Despite the initial tension, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't going to give up on rebuilding my relationship with Tamsin. Not now. Not ever. As the evening progressed, I stayed on the fringes of the celebration, observing and occasionally engaging in small talk with distant relatives and friends. Megan stayed close, her presence a comforting anchor. Eventually, Tamsin reappeared, her expression softer, less guarded. She approached me hesitantly. Father, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I want to try. I want to understand. Can we talk? Maybe not today, but soon? A wave of relief washed over me. Of course, Tamsin. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. She gave me a small, tentative smile. Thank you. I'll see you around. With that, she walked away, but this time there was a promise of reconciliation in the air. Megan squeezed my hand reassuringly, and Albert gave me a nod of approval. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. After watching her leave, Albert turned to me, his expression a mix of sympathy and frustration. William, I'm afraid your daughter has only heard a one-sided account of her parents' divorce. It didn't help that you and Hyacinth didn't hit it off from the start. I was never good enough for Shauna in her mother's eyes, sir, I replied, feeling the old bitterness resurface. Albert nodded solemnly. No one could be good enough for Hyacinth, William. I don't think even my brother fits that description in my sister-in-law's eyes. He sighed deeply. From the looks of it, however, Hyacinth may have thrown in the towel. She's up there on the platform, apparently rearranging the seats at the top table. When I looked, sure enough, the witch, assisted by her ever-awkward husband George, was indeed rearranging the serving pieces. As we watched, one of the photographers approached them. The witch spoke to him briefly, and then Hyacinth, evidently pleased with her rearrangements, left the platform with her small entourage in tow. They're getting ready for group photos, Billy, Megan informed me quietly. We'd better go. No, you go ahead, Megan. Tamsin won't be thrilled with my presence. Besides, I'll look completely out of place in the pictures without the monkey suit. It'll ruin the whole set. Billy, Megan protested, her voice filled with concern. Don't argue, Megan, I said firmly. I'm on the verge of leaving anyway. I knew this was a bad idea. After a few more protests from both Megan and her uncle Albert, they reluctantly left me alone and went outside for the photo shoot. To my relief, almost all the other guests also went out into the hotel garden to watch or participate. I took this opportunity to slip onto the platform and do a little shuffling of my own. Sure enough, the witch had seated me next to Tamsin's new husband. Given my daughter's behavior and the fact that I'd never met this young man before, I thought it was fraught with trouble. And besides Megan, Uncle Albert and his wife, apparently my only open allies, were seated at the far end of the table. So, I placed Grandpa Tamsin in that seat, as I suspected that's where he had originally planned to sit. Then I stuck my own hastily scribbled card next to Megan's at the end of the table. I figured it would be safer that way. Upon returning from the photo shoot, Megan briefly slipped into spoiled child mode. It had been a while since I'd seen her act like that, and I found it oddly amusing. I figured my refusal to participate in the photo shoot had prompted her to do it. "Well, if you keep acting like this, I'm going to go find a bar," I said, trying to keep a straight face. Megan pouted but quickly composed herself. "Fine, but you owe me a dance later." I chuckled. "Deal." The reception proceeded smoothly, and despite my initial reservations, I found myself enjoying parts of it. Megan and Albert made sure I wasn't left out of conversations, and even a few of the guests who initially seemed wary warmed up as the evening went on. Later, as promised, I danced with Megan. She was light on her feet and full of laughter, her earlier sulkiness forgotten. As we twirled around the dance floor, I caught sight of Tamsin watching us. Her expression was softer, almost curious. I gave her a small smile, hoping it was a step towards mending our fractured relationship. By the end of the night, I felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. It hadn't been the smoothest of reunions, but it was a start. As I walked Megan to her car, she squeezed my hand. "Thanks for coming, Billy. It meant a lot to Tamsin, even if she can't admit it yet." "Thanks for convincing me, Megan," I replied sincerely, "and for everything else." She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Anytime, big brother." As I watched her drive away, I felt a sense of resolve. Rebuilding bridges wouldn't be easy, but with Megan and Albert's support, I knew it was possible. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally on the right path. "Just try to dare and I'll," replied Megan, her eyes sparkling mischievously. "And what are you going to do, Megan?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not sure. Maybe kiss you. I've always wanted to do that, but I've never had the courage," she confessed, her tone both teasing and sincere. I had always known Shauna's little sister held a candle for me, but I was surprised to hear from Megan that she was still carrying that torch after all these years. "Oh my God, Megan, I thought you'd long since grown out of silly teenage crushes," I said, half jokingly. "Oh yeah, I even found what I thought was the man of my dreams. But I soon discovered that all that glitters is not gold, and what you see isn't always what you get. It wasn't until I divorced the creep that I realized exactly what my sister had so flippantly discarded." "I'm not at all sure I understand what you meant by that, Megan," I said, feeling genuinely perplexed. "Okay, a confused person is safe," she grinned. "Come on, looks like they're sitting down to eat." The top table was inordinately long, and Megan and her guest had originally been seated somewhat lower in rank. Though the witch had rearranged everything, I, to the old bitch's utter bewilderment, undid her changes. Great fun, it seemed to me. The witch seemed to accept my rearrangement without protest, but gave me a baleful glare as if she was plotting my downfall right there. Albert sat next to Megan, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "I thought Hyacinth," he started to comment as we took our seats. "I thought her original plan would prove more diplomatic, sir," I interrupted him, leaning in conspiratorially. "With a capital letter, I always knew Hyacinth was wrong about you, my boy. Anyway, drop the formalities, please. To the family, I am Birdie." Throughout most of the meal, Albert monopolized me in conversation, his sharp eyes gleaming with interest. Virtually oblivious to everyone else sitting around him, including his wife, but with the exception of Megan, who sat between us, he spent almost the entire meal asking me pointed questions about my travels. I almost felt like I was in a witness box. Well, he was a top-class barrister, used to cross-examination. "Well, let's see how they handle it, shall we?" commented Albert, leaning back in his chair as the master of ceremonies called for silence for the formal toasts. Grandpa Tamsin, who I assume paid for the party, stood up and gave a brief welcome speech. And then the old git caught me off guard by calling the father of the bride to say a few words and proposing a toast to the happy couple. Judging from the looks on the witch and Tamsin's faces, his proposal was not part of the master plan and was not approved, and it certainly didn't meet with everyone's approval. As I said, the old fool caught me completely confused and totally unprepared, so I had to quickly gather my strength and act on my wings. I really can't remember almost anything I said that day. I think I started by muttering about unfortunate circumstances or something like that. But then I started talking about Tamsin, inserting anecdotes about her childhood, her strong will, and her kind heart, trying to paint a picture of a proud father rather than a distant one. I spoke of the little girl who used to ride on my shoulders, the teenager who was so determined to succeed, and the young woman who stood before us now, ready to embark on a new journey. By the end of my impromptu speech, there were tears in a few eyes, including mine, and the room was filled with a respectful silence. To Tamsin and her new husband, I concluded, raising my glass high, may your life together be filled with love, laughter, and endless adventures. As I sat down, Albert patted me on the back, and Megan squeezed my hand. The witch's glare had softened, if only slightly, and even Tamsin seemed to be reassessing her earlier hostility. For the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better from here. Almost every humorous incident from her life that I knew of into the speech. Anyway, the speech must have been pretty good, and I suppose prepared in advance, because I was shocked to find the whole damn room erupting into fits of laughter. Perhaps it was because I was making such a fool of myself that they were laughing at me. But even the witch's face cracked at some point in my musings. Then, remembering that I was breaking the magic 7-minute rule, yes, I kept my eyes on the clock, never has the minute hand moved so slowly, I proposed a toast to my new son-in-law and his beautiful bride, and then threw the ball into the groom's court. "That was great, Billy. How long did you prepare that speech?" asked Megan, as I collapsed into my seat. "Was the sound okay?" I asked, not believing I had managed to do that. "Capital, capital, my boy," repeated Albert. "With that kind of turnover, you could make a fortune in after-dinner speeches." Looking at the burly Albert, I realized he knew what he was talking about when it came to after-dinner conversations, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I don't know exactly what happened afterwards, but I do know that there seemed to be an endless circle of people jumping to their feet and reciting surprisingly long and often unintelligent dissertations. There were also toasts to all the Toms, Dicks, and Harrys you can think of, including the Queen. I'm not quite sure how she fit into the equation. Perhaps someone was trying to complete a seemingly endless cycle of mundane speeches. I noted that none of the speakers could match my own performance. "Come along, my boy. I have a little corner I have picked out and reserved," said Albert, as people finally began to leave the dining room. It was at this point that I began to suspect that Megan and her Uncle Albert had somehow pre-planned my day. Perhaps it was only a rough sketch, but they both clearly knew what they were doing and seemed to be working in unison. Uncle Albert's wife never said much to me, but smiled pleasantly whenever our eyes met. Megan, taking my right hand firmly in hers again, led me into the next room and sat me at a table near the bar. Oddly for a wedding reception, this table was in a separate little sectioned-off area, the sort of executive areas you sometimes find in high-end nightclubs. I'd always considered such things pretentious and felt out of place sitting there. A young woman, who appeared to have been assigned as Albert's personal waitress, quickly appeared and took our drink orders. I noticed that almost everyone else had to stand in line at the bar to get a soft drink. Few of them managed to catch the young woman's eye as they tried to order from her. I also noticed that there was a similar enclosure at the far end of the room, but it had remained empty for the time being. Later, I noticed that the witch, her husband, and a few of their close friends were the ones who ended up there. Their presence was a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere of our little enclave, where Albert, Megan, and I were sharing stories and laughing heartily. Megan leaned over and whispered, "I think we made the right move, Billy. Uncle Albert always knows how to play these things." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. Despite the initial tension, the evening had turned out much better than I had anticipated. As the night wore on, I found myself enjoying the company and the unexpected camaraderie. For a brief moment, it felt like old times, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia for the days when things were simpler. As we clinked glasses once more, I realized that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to mend some of the bridges that had been burned over the years. And with Megan and Albert by my side, I felt more hopeful than I had in a long time. And the groom's parents periodically retreated there. Shortly after we were served our first round of drinks, Sir Albert Stone began to hold court. Numerous younger members of the Stone clan, some of whom I met at my own wedding many years ago, would arrive, introduce their mostly adorable but sometimes hideous offspring to Uncle Albert. Then, after carefully raising their hats to the patriarch of the family, they would disappear back into the crowd. The meaningless pantomime bored me silly and lasted probably about an hour. During the whole time, Albert did nothing but repeat his favorite phrase, "Capital! Capital!" Sometimes he even added a third capital to make it more convincing. Honestly, if this whole thing weren't so ridiculous, it might be funny. I tried to ignore the pantomime and probably would have backed off if Megan hadn't clutched at my arm as hard as she could. And unfortunately, Albert decided to make sure that all of our visitors were reminded, and in some cases informed, that I was Tamsin's biological father. I believe that Albert wanted to let those who thought otherwise know that he had decided to revoke my former status as a family pariah. Whenever I tried to ignore what was going on nearby while chatting with Megan, Albert would introduce another family member, whether he knew me or not. There was one brief interlude of sycophancy while her new husband spun Tamsin around the dance floor. No, I wasn't asked to dance with anyone at this time, which in a way was very convenient because I'm not much for the old formalities, especially when me and my partner are the center of attention. "I suppose that's the last of them," said Albert with relief in his voice as the last little family group withdrew from our enclave. "Now, my boy, I really think we'd better get down to serious business. We can't have your daughter addressing her father the way she did before. Damn impertinent of the kid. It would have been nice if you'd been around to get her on her knees and give her a good spanking years ago. She sure needed it. Heck, her mother needed it too." George was always too soft on Shauna, and then there's young Megan. "Oh, hello, Uncle Albert," grumbled Megan. "Oh, you weren't so bad, Megan. But you have to admit you were a sassy little kid sometimes. Sometimes you gave your parents a real dance and song." "I've never been as bad as Shauna, Uncle." "No, I'll agree with you, Megan. But I'm sure if William had put Shauna on his lap and tanned her back the first time she got over herself, everyone's life would have been a lot easier, including his own." "Knowing Shauna, I'd spend most of that time behind bars, Albert," interjected I. "Yes, you're right. Perhaps that would be the case, William." Shauna was her own person and showed a distinct lack of common sense and conscience on occasion. "On occasion?" asked Megan. "Shauna had a knack for finding trouble and dragging everyone else into it with her." "True, true," said Albert, nodding thoughtfully. "But we must move forward. William, you must re-establish your presence in Tamsin's life. She deserves to know the truth about her father, not just the one-sided stories she's been fed." Megan squeezed my arm, giving me an encouraging smile. "We'll help you, Billy. Uncle Albert is right. You deserve to be a part of her life." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their words. "All right, let's do this. For Tamsin's sake and for mine." Albert raised his glass. "To new beginnings and family reunions. Capital!" Megan and I raised our glasses in unison, echoing the sentiment. Capital! As the evening continued, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Surrounded by unexpected allies, I realized that perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope for mending the fractured bonds of my past. And with Megan and Albert by my side, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Times in my entire life. "You seem to know a lot about me, sir." "Of course, young man. After everything that has happened, I feel a sense of duty to keep an eye on you. If I could do nothing else, I could at least ensure that you don't get into any more trouble." "I don't understand, sir. Enough with the formalities, William. I'm on your side. I've always been on your side. Didn't Megan assure you of that?" I must have nodded or given some sign of agreement because he continued. "Capital. Bear with me a little longer, young man, and everything will become clear to you." "I hope so," I replied. "I also hope that you will understand my situation and be able to find it in your heart to forgive me for not taking action sooner." "You've totally confused me now," I said, trying to make sense of his words. "Bertie," I added. My answer brought a smile to the old man's face, but it didn't linger there long. His gaze moved to the far end of the room. Following his line of sight, I saw Witch and George entering the living room. They were quickly followed by Tamsin and her husband, All four of them were invited to sit on the neighboring couches across from us. Albert's gaze returned to the entrance of the living room. It was obvious that he expected someone else to join us. "What is the meaning of all this, Bertie?" demanded the witch. "Why have you called us here? We've got company." "Please be quiet, Hyacinth. Without your intervention, I'm sure none of this would have been necessary." Shauna was a frivolous girl who made an honest mistake that she was willing to admit until you talked her out of it. "I don't know what you're talking about." The witch started to rant, but her husband silenced her. "Shut up, Hyacinth. Bertie is quite right," snapped George. "Oh my God, worms," I thought to myself. This was something I never dreamed of. At that moment, a man in a black suit and dog collar entered the living room. I recognized him immediately as another prominent member of the Stone clan, Father Connor, clearly of Irish descent. However, I was never able to find out his place in the Stone family tree. As far as I knew, all the other members of the Stone clan were strictly Catholic. This man, though, had always been pleasant to me on the few occasions we had met. I should add that, whether or not Father Connor held a different faith, he held the same patriarchal position in the family clan as Sir Albert Stone. While the crowd gathered in the main hall, I had seen Father Connor a couple of times, diligently making his way around all the family members. Albert rose to his feet to greet Father Connor, and then the priest turned to me and shook my hand. I jumped to my feet as soon as Albert rose to his. "I'm glad you decided to attend today, William. You did a fine job with your speech, young man. Your daughter was certainly surprised to learn that you are so well versed in her life story." Father Connor cast a quick glance at Tamsin as he spoke. My daughter looked a little embarrassed. "Thank you, Father. I hope you're doing well." "As God intended, William. Now, Megan, have you been avoiding me today?" The good father turned his attention to Megan. I waited patiently for him to finish with Megan, and then we all sat down again. The room was filled with a tension that could be cut with a knife, but there was also a sense of anticipation. Everyone was waiting for something to unfold, something that had been brewing for a long time. Albert took a deep breath and addressed the room. "Today is a day of reconciliation and truth. It's time we addressed the past, laid it bare, and hopefully moved forward as a family." He looked at each one of us, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Let's not allow old wounds to fester any longer. It's time for healing." As the gravity of his words settled in, I realized that this gathering was more than just about Tamsin's wedding. It was about mending the fractured ties and uncovering the truths that had been hidden for too long. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could finally be set right. Uncle Albert cleared his throat noisily, effectively signaling, "Now let's get down to business." But it was Father Connor who spoke first. "Bertie, you do realize that confessions are supposed to be confidential, right?" "Totally, Joe," Albert replied. "Until recently, my actions have been equally limited. However, it seems to me that I might be able to think of a way out of our general predicament." "Very well, as long as everyone understands that I cannot divulge anything that has been told to me in confidence," Father Connor repeated. Albert gave Tamsin a friendly look. "Tamsin, would you deny me a favor? I want you to imagine that we are in a courtroom and that you are testifying. You are under oath, if you understand me." "Yes, Uncle Bertie, but I don't," began Tamsin to answer. "I don't expect you to understand, Tamsin. Not yet. I hope it will become clear to you soon. If not, all this pantomime will prove to be a waste of time. I just want you to answer my questions as fully and honestly as you can under the circumstances. Anything I ask you to say will be hearsay anyway, so it will have no legal effect in a court of law." "So are you kidding me?" "Of course, Uncle Bertie. Now I want you to tell us everything you know about the breakup of your parents' marriage." "Wait, Bertie," I tried to interject. "Be quiet, Billy. This is my playpen," admonished Albert to me. To be honest, I was quite taken aback by this rebuke, not so much because of Albert's sharp remark. Rather, it was the fact that he addressed me as Billy. "Now, Tamsin, if you would be so kind," continued Albert. "Albert, she was only a little girl then. You demand too much of Tamsin," exclaimed the witch. "You know, you're probably right, Hyacintha." Albert agreed. "Why don't you tell us the story? As I recall, you were there and were old enough to know what was going on. I'm sure you've repeated the story often enough over the years to know it by heart." I don't think I can," replied the witch. For the first time ever, I saw that she was unsure of herself and even looked embarrassed. "Oh, but I'm sure you can, Hyacintha. Your diatribe against William here has been your party piece for years." Albert's attack on her grandmother stirred something in Tamsin. She straightened suddenly. "I'll do it," she started to say, but Albert stopped her. Albert seemed adamant that the story be told by the witch. I don't understand why, but I have to assume that Albert's initial request that Tamsin tell the story was some sort of legal trick designed to accomplish something. I don't know what. How legal minds work is often a mystery to us mere mortals. Eventually, the witch relented, though she averted her eyes from my gaze the entire time she spoke. I'm not going to repeat Hyacinth's words here. Some of what she told was completely out of chronological order, and even more of it had nothing to do with the actual events of the time, mother and daughter. Nevertheless, I will try to recount the main points of the story as the witch told it that day. Witch's diatribe. Shauna and William had already been in America for a few months working on a movie. According to Hyacintha, their relationship had started to deteriorate long before they arrived in the States. Shauna, she claimed, had confided in her about William's temper and his growing jealousy over her rising career. Hyacintha painted me as a possessive, controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's success. She even implied that I had sabotaged her opportunities and belittled her achievements to keep her under my thumb. She went on to describe how Shauna had met a charming director who offered her a role that could have been her big break. Shauna had hesitated, knowing how I would react, but ultimately decided to take the opportunity. This, according to Hyacintha, was the final straw. My jealousy turned into rage, leading to a confrontation that spiraled out of control. Hyacintha's version of the story ended with Shauna fleeing to her mother's house, seeking refuge from my supposed wrath. She described a scared and broken woman, desperate to escape an oppressive marriage. I listened in silence, my fists clenched, as Hyacintha continued to malign me. When she finished, the room was quiet, everyone absorbing the dramatic retelling. Albert finally spoke up. "Thank you, Hyacintha, for sharing your perspective. Now, William, it's only fair that you have the opportunity to tell your side of the story." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze. "It's true that Shauna and I had our problems," I began, my voice steady. "But it's not true that I was jealous of her success or that I tried to control her. I loved Shauna deeply and supported her career. Our issues were more complicated than Hyacintha's version suggests." I went on to explain how Shauna had become increasingly distant, often disappearing for days without explanation. I had discovered her affair with the director when I found them together in our home. The confrontation that followed was heated, but it was Shauna who had lashed out first. I had never laid a hand on her, despite what Hyacintha implied. When Shauna left, I was devastated, I continued, my voice breaking. I wanted to fix things, but she refused to talk to me. Instead, she ran to her mother, and the next thing I knew, there were restraining orders and divorce papers. Albert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, William. It's important that everyone hears both sides. The truth often lies somewhere in between." Father Connor stepped forward, his demeanor calm and reassuring. "Reconciliation begins with understanding. We've heard two versions of the past. Now it's time to find a way forward." Tamsin, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "I don't know what to believe," she said softly. "All I know is that I've missed having a father in my life." Her words cut through the tension, bringing a sense of vulnerability to the room. I looked at her, my heart aching. "Tamsin, I never stopped loving you. I've always wanted to be a part of your life. If you'll let me, I want to make up for lost time." Tamsin's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I want that too." Albert stood up, raising his glass. "To new beginnings and the courage to face the past. Let's move forward as a family." Everyone raised their glasses, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could heal the wounds of the past and build a better future together. It was Shauna's first feature film, and William was working as an assistant cameraman or something like that. Larry Parker, the director of the movie, was very impressed with Shauna's acting ability and told me that she was about to become a big star. We thought it was going so well. When she called home, Shauna was very excited about getting her big chance to be in the movie. Having 18-month-old Tamsin with her made things a little more difficult, though. Shauna told us that several of the girls on the set were very responsive and looked after Tamsin when she was on set. But one night, everything changed. We got a call that William had gone out and gotten drunk out of his mind. He had gone back to the cabin he and Shauna shared, where she was rehearsing her lines for the next day's filming with Larry's help. For some inexplicable reason, William became enraged and attacked Shauna and poor Larry with a broken chair leg. Luckily, Larry managed to overpower William by knocking him out before he could kill them both. From what I understand, William was completely out of it. However, Larry was unable to prevent William from breaking Shauna's cheekbone. Poor Larry had a hard time too, because William gave him a very nasty black eye. The police, of course, brought an assault case against William, but I brought Tamsin back to my place in the UK before the case went to court. I know he was sent to prison, but I have no idea for how long. And of course, he was deported back to the UK after serving his sentence. After William beat her, Shauna divorced William. What else was a poor child to do? No woman should have to endure such treatment from her husband. Shauna was supposed to get another, much larger role in a movie that was to be filmed in Hollywood. Larry had arranged it, but her face never healed before filming began, and she lost that opportunity. William's rampage that night robbed Shauna of the chance to be the successful actress she was supposed to be. The poor girl was so terrified of what William would do when he returned to the country that we were forced to get a court order forbidding him to go near her. As we all know, there have been several legal battles over the years, but from that day to this day, we have not seen William outside of a courtroom. The witch, looking quite pleased with herself, leaned back on the back of the couch, effectively announcing that the story was over. But I noticed that she was still not looking me in the eye. I was convinced that she couldn't do that, because she was well aware that the story she had just told was neither a complete nor an accurate picture of what had happened in the States that weekend. I didn't sit silently and listen to the witch's dialogue as Albert wanted me to. Several times I had to object, add, or correct details that the witch either ignored or didn't know about. However, Megan, still clinging tightly to my right hand, seemed to sense every time I was beginning to lose my patience. She squeezed my hand, and almost at the same instant, apparently they were communicating somehow. Her Uncle Albert signaled me to be quiet. "You seem to be a very rowdy drunk, William," remarked Albert. "I find that very hard to believe. And it's also rather strange that you managed to keep out of jail already. It must have been 22 years. I nodded, confirming Albert's assessment. "It's rather odd that I haven't gotten any reports of you losing control of your emotions while under the influence. For the information of those of you not in the know, William has been watched for years by certain aides. And for some time, William has been, well, let's face it, a little violent. Be that as it may, I have a feeling that William's interpretation of events will have a slightly different connotation. Why don't you enlighten us as to your take on that ill-fated weekend, William?" I unhooked Megan from my arm and shifted a little in the seat. I didn't want her to interrupt me or disturb my thoughts. In fact, I suddenly felt naked without the comforting feeling of Megan beside me. Then I looked directly at Tamsin, because she was the one I needed to understand. What your grandmother said was wrong from the beginning. A friend asked me to be the second unit cameraman on that movie. It was supposed to be an action movie set in a mountainous area. The second unit had to shoot all the long shots, often with understudies instead of the main actors. That's always been my strong point, long shots and working with the phone. They only paid for Shauna to fly to the States because I refused to fly without her. I thought of it as a nice free vacation for Shauna. The crew rented a winter vacation complex of sorts. They probably got it on the cheap because it was filmed outside of the regular season. I didn't think for a minute that they would ask Shauna to replace an actor who broke his leg on the first day of filming. True, they had to do a little creative work to turn a small role into a female character. Shauna did a couple TV commercials, so she was in the right place at the right time. It was cheaper to use her than to find and then fly in another actor. Oh, they cut her skiing scene. Once bitten, twice shy, if you know what I mean. I had absolutely no idea what was going on behind my back, even though I knew Larry Parker was probably banging some naive girl on the team. That's just the way Larry is. He was notorious in the industry for his adventures. Besides, I considered Parker my friend, and I was wrong in thinking that friends don't seduce other friends' wives. We finished shooting on location that Friday. Everything else was supposed to be filmed at the studio. Shauna's character was not required for any of that filming. It was a very small role. Anyway, on Friday afternoon, me and the rest of my team had to pack all of our gear to have it ready to return to the rental company. All technical gear is hired as needed. In any case, the packing went better than planned, so we finished earlier than expected. I decided to go out for a drink to celebrate. I didn't get drunk out of my mind, as the witch said, but I did have a few. When I got back to the cabin, I found Shauna and Larry rehearsing together. I didn't realize what was really going on until much later. Shauna was rehearsing her lines, but the looks and the touches they exchanged were too intimate to be just acting. I confronted them. Words were exchanged, and things got heated. I did pick up a chair leg, but I never intended to hurt Shauna. I was aiming for Larry. He dodged, and in the chaos, Shauna got hit. Yes, I hit Larry too, and he fought back. But it wasn't as one-sided as the witch made it sound. I was defending my marriage. The police arrived, and I was arrested. It was a nightmare. Shauna took Tamsin and went back to the UK, and I was left to deal with the fallout. I was sentenced to a year in prison, and when I got out, I was deported. I didn't break Shauna's cheekbone on purpose. It was an accident. And as for the restraining order, it was based on exaggerated claims and half-truths. I never had the chance to defend myself properly. Tamsin's eyes were wide, and she looked at me with a mix of shock and something else, maybe a hint of understanding. I never stopped loving you, Tamsin, I continued. I wanted to be part of your life, but circumstances kept us apart. If you can find it in your heart to give me a chance, I promise I'll make it up to you. Albert nodded, his expression serious. Thank you, William. I think we've all heard enough to understand that there are two sides to every story. Now it's up to us as a family to move forward and heal the wounds of the past. Father Connor added, reconciliation is a difficult journey, but it's one worth taking. Let's all commit to being honest, open, and forgiving as we move forward. The room was silent for a moment, and then Tamsin spoke. I need time to process all this, but I do want to try. I want to know my father. Her words were a balm to my soul. I nodded, tears in my eyes. Thank you, Tamsin, that's all I ask. Albert raised his glass again. To new beginnings and the courage to face the past. Everyone raised their glasses, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope and the possibility of redemption, and we got everything packed up much sooner than I expected. I got back to the cabin that Shauna and I shared around 5:30. I didn't think I'd be back there before 10 in the evening, but when I got there, it was empty. No loving wife, no sleeping child. All I found was a note. This note. I pulled out my wallet and handed Tamsin the tattered piece of paper. Albert, however, took it from my hands. He slowly and very carefully unfolded the rest of the document. Then he read aloud the words scrawled on it. Billy, I'm going away with Larry. He loves me and is going to make me a big star in Hollywood. Please don't follow us and don't make a fuss. Shauna. Short and to the point, Albert commented. Go on, William, but I think we all understand where this is going. Shooting on location is over, you say? Yes, sir, it was, replied I. Then it turns out Shauna's practicing lines for the story for the next day, doesn't it? But carry on anyway, kid. Let's get to the fun part. You have only his word for it, the witch bellowed. How do you know he's not lying? Very true, Hyacinth, Albert agreed. Let's see if we can verify a few facts. Albert looked towards the three strangers. Reginald, if you would be so kind. A man who didn't look familiar to me stood up and walked toward us, carrying a briefcase. Sir? He addressed Albert as soon as he came within a comfortable distance. Do you have copies of the script for this movie? Reginald didn't answer anything. He pulled a folder out of his briefcase and held it out to Albert. Albert didn't even bother to open the folder, just tossed it on the coffee table with the couches around it. If anyone wishes to dispute William's account, they will find that it is corroborated by the contents of this file. Now go on, William, please. I was confused for a few seconds, interrupting my train of thought. I had to literally calm my emotions before I could continue. When I found that note, I was horrified and apoplectic. Yes, and I took a couple of drinks to calm my nerves. But then I realized that I wasn't supposed to return to camp until the evening. What's more, I remembered seeing Larry's rental car parked outside his cabin when we got back to camp. Then it occurred to me that Shauna and Larry might have miscalculated. They thought they'd be long gone before I found that note. I have no idea what the prudent thing to do in those circumstances was. All I know is that I wanted at least an explanation from Shauna as to what kind of game she was playing. Parker, I was sure, would dump Shauna as soon as another stupid slut caught his eye. I really couldn't believe that Shauna had forgotten everything I had told her about how the man operated. I wasn't stupid enough to introduce my wife to Parker without preparing her beforehand. And when that nasty type turned on the charm, even the blood-sucking birds in the trees flew to him. Anyway, I found them in the kitchen at Larry's cabin. Parker didn't interest me. I could have dealt with him at any time. He couldn't hide from me for long and stay in the industry, if you know what I mean. I wanted Shauna to explain why she didn't take my warning seriously. However, Larry Parker misjudged my intentions. Perhaps he had been pursued by other spouses in the past. In any case, frankly, he came at me like the proverbial bull at a china shop. I just ducked to the side, and Parker whizzed past me and crashed into the back door, shattering the glass in the process. For a moment, I thought Parker was trying to run. It was later argued in court that I broke the glass by sneaking into the cabin. The fact that the broken shards were on the floor outside and that I had no cuts on my arm, and Larry did, was apparently ignored. Of course, it didn't help that I couldn't remember much about the day until I first regained consciousness and didn't for several years. But now, I can remember everything in great detail. I don't know how one can describe Larry Parker's fighting technique because it doesn't fit into any of the categories I know of. Anyway, as soon as he recovered from his collision with the door, he lunged at me again. I ducked again, but managed to hit him once as he passed me. I figured it would cool his ardor a bit or something. Big mistake. My punch changed the direction of his rampage. Parker ran into Shauna, and they collapsed to the floor. Shauna was still, to my surprise, sitting on the chair next to the bar. I guess it was the same chair that didn't survive the collision. I actually thought Parker was out of the game, and Shauna didn't look too smart. So I pulled Parker off of her and helped Shauna to her feet. I remember Shauna looking me in the eye. Apparently she was very stunned. And then the damn lights went out. When I awoke 4 days later, I found myself confined to a hospital bed. I remembered nothing of the day in question, nor of the few days that had preceded it. Memories that were to return, I would add very slowly over the following months and years. Anyway, Tamsin, these are my memories of that fateful day. Everything that has happened since then has been completely out of my control. I have no idea who or what hit me, and I have come to the conclusion that it was Larry Parker's head that broke your mother's cheekbone when he crashed into her. I surmise that it was he who cracked me over the head, fracturing my skull with the leg from that broken chair Shauna was sitting on. Why those two decided to accuse me of fighting, I have no idea. And since your mother, with the help of her lawyers, made sure I didn't get close enough to ask her, I learned that Larry Parker was found dead from bullet wounds in a motel room in Los Angeles while I was still enjoying the hospitality of the American legal system, so I couldn't ask him about it. I strongly suspect that Parker decided to sleep with the wrong spouse. Larry Parker seems to have discovered that some Yankees can be extremely possessive and quite vindictive. Plus, they can be very energetic in their handling of firearms. I leaned back on the back of the couch, unable to add anything else, lest I seem too vindictive or bitter. My story hung in the air, raw and full of unresolved pain. I looked at Tamsin, hoping she would see the truth in my eyes, hoping she would understand that I never wanted any of this to happen. Albert cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. Thank you, William. I believe we've heard enough. It's clear there are many layers to this story, and it's not as black and white as it was made out to be. Tamsin sat quietly for a moment, processing everything she had just heard. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. I need time to think about all this, to really understand it. But I want to know more. I want to know my father, the real story, not just what I've been told. Her words were a lifeline, a chance at redemption. I nodded, tears threatening to spill. Thank you, Tamsin. I promise I'll tell you everything, answer any questions you have. I just want a chance to be part of your life. Albert raised his glass again. To truth and reconciliation, to understanding and new beginnings. Everyone raised their glasses, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. The past was painful, but perhaps, just perhaps, the future held the promise of healing and redemption. Toward my daughter's mother. Megan clutched my right hand again and kissed my cheek in surprise. Tamsin sat silently, staring at me, as if trying to look right into my brain. Suddenly, she shifted her gaze to Albert. You know what really happened, don't you, Uncle Albert? Mother told you, didn't she? Then Tamsin instantly shifted her penetrating gaze to Father Connor. She told you too. She did so, my child, but like your Uncle Albert's, our hands were tied, Father Connor replied. We cannot divulge what has been told to us in the strictest secrecy. In my case, it is a confession. In Albert's case, attorney's privilege, added Tamsin's new husband. That's when I first realized the guy spoke American. His mother and father were definitely not American. In the British legal system, we use a different term for it, young man, but essentially it boils down to the same restriction of action, Albert assured him. Tamsin, I'm sure your mother wouldn't lie to you, the witch ventured. Tamsin jumped to her feet and gave her grandmother a hostile look. She shifted so that she could look her grandmother directly in the eye. Me too, grandmother, but my mother never actually explained to me what happened back then. What I know, I learned elsewhere. Whenever I asked my mother about it, she always changed the subject or went off in another direction. Suddenly, Tamsin spun on her heels and walked across the room to where the three strangers were sitting and turned to the man who seemed familiar. I recognize you, don't I? She demanded. Yes, young lady, perhaps it is, replied the man. Uncle Albert hinted that someone was looking out for me, and I can remember seeing you more than once at my school. I'm also sure I saw you a few times in Bristol when I was at university. It's possible, miss, the man agreed. So, given the fact that my uncle has hinted that my father is also being watched by someone, and I know that Reginald and Shirley work in my Uncle Albert's London office, I suspect that it is you who has been watching my father as much as I have. Am I right? As it should be. Yes, miss, you're right, replied the man. So what are you, a private investigator? I'm a retired police officer, miss, the one your uncle turns to when he requires my specialized services. Tamsin turned, looked me straight in the eye, and grinned. Then she turned back to the man. I assume you have studied the events of that evening very carefully over the years? The man confirmed with a nod of his head. Then please tell me, do you believe my father is an honest man? Has he not deceived us today? Not to my knowledge, miss, replied the man. Thank you, officer. I'm sorry you didn't give your name. Retired Sergeant White, miss, Chalky to my friends. Thank you, Chalky. Why Uncle Bertie didn't send you just to tell me the truth, I don't understand. I only do what I'm asked to do, miss. And could you shed some light on why my Uncle Albert had to keep quiet for so long, Chalky? I can only speculate, miss, but I believe your uncle was defending some unnamed person against a charge of perjury. But why would she want to perjure herself in the first place? That I can't tell you, miss. However, I might point out that a movie producer cannot promote a young actress if he himself is sitting in a jail cell with a felony conviction for grievous bodily harm, or whatever they call it in America. Suddenly it all made sense, exclaimed Tamsin. How long have you known your father? She asked, turning to look at me. No, Tamsin, but that's what I assumed, I replied. I don't know how seriously your mother was hurt that night, but I wasn't sure from the beginning that she remembered the events as clearly as she claimed in court. Shauna may have repeated to the police the story Parker fed her. Tamsin turned to Chalky again. May I invite you and your assistants to be my husband and my guests of honor for the rest of the evening? She asked. All three of them thanked Tamsin, after which she literally pushed them out into the main function room. Then she slowly walked back across the room to us, looking me straight in the eye the whole time. Tamsin, the witch began stepping closer. Please don't talk to me now, Grandma. I'm too angry, and I might say something I'll regret. Grandfather, be good enough to see your wife off and attend to the guests. Paul and I will be out soon. Without a word, George lifted the witch to her feet and guided her down the road. Tamsin walked over and hugged Father Connor and then Uncle Albert. She did not speak to them, but just hugged them. Then she turned to Megan and to me. May I take your mind off my father for a moment, Aunt Megan? I'd like to talk to him alone. Then she turned to her husband. Paul, Aunt Megan likes to dance. The guy understood, and so did Megan. When they walked out into the main hall, Tamsin, still holding my hand the same way Megan had been all day, headed out into the hotel gardens. For a very long time, Tamsin didn't speak, just held tightly to my left hand. But finally she asked, How can I begin to apologize to you, Father? Slightly confused, I asked, Why, baby? She stopped, and I turned around to face her. Well, I guess the way I spoke to you earlier, but I feel like I have something to apologize to you for. If I could just figure out exactly what for, I'd feel a lot happier. The truth is, kid, you're the one who should be apologizing. You and I are the victims. All we have to do now is make up for lost time, I replied. You don't look very angry, Father. I've had many years to realize that anger doesn't make things better, Tamsin. What it can do, though, is get you in very deep trouble. Believe me, I've been through this before. But Grandma, your grandmother never loved me, Tamsin, ever since your mom and I started courting. But why? What did you do that upset her? I was born on the side your grandmother considers wrong, Tamsin, and I courted her daughter. Snobbery, plain and simple. Will I like my father looking over my shoulder? I hope so, kiddo, but I won't be able to be around every moment. What I can promise you is this. From this day forward, I'll be the father you deserve, and we'll take on the future together. It's never too late to start anew. I can only speculate, miss, but I believe your uncle was defending some unnamed person against a charge of perjury. But why would she want to perjure herself in the first place? Tamsin inquired, frustration evident in her voice. That I can't tell you, miss. However, I might point out that a movie producer cannot promote a young actress if he himself is sitting in a jail cell with a felony conviction for grievous bodily harm, or whatever they call it in America, Petty explained, his tone matter of fact. Suddenly, it all makes sense, Tamsin exclaimed, turning her sharp gaze back to me. How long have you known Father? She asked, her eyes narrowing. No, Tamsin, but that's what I assumed, I replied, my voice steady. I don't know how seriously your mother was hurt that night, but I wasn't sure from the beginning that she remembered the events as clearly as she claimed in court. Shauna may have repeated to the police the story Parker fed her. Tamsin turned to Petty again. May I invite you and your assistants to be my husbands and my guests of honor for the rest of the evening? She asked. All three of them thanked Tamsin, after which she literally pushed them out into the main function room. Then she slowly walked back across the room to us, looking me straight in the eye the whole time. Tamsin, the witch began stepping closer. Please don't talk to me now, Grandma. I'm too angry, and I might say something I'll regret. Grandfather, be good enough to see your wife off and attend to the guests. Paul and I will be out soon. Without a word, George lifted the witch to her feet and guided her down the hallway. Tamsin walked over and hugged Father Connor and then Uncle Albert. She did not speak to them, but just hugged them. Then she turned to Megan and to me. May I take your mind off my father for a moment, Aunt Megan? I'd like to talk to him alone. Then she turned to her husband. Paul, Aunt Megan likes to dance. Paul understood immediately, and so did Megan. As they walked out into the main hall, Tamsin had been holding my hand the same way Megan had been all day, headed out into the hotel gardens. For a very long time, Tamsin didn't speak, just held tightly to my left hand. But finally she asked, How can I begin to apologize to you, Father? Slightly confused, I asked, Why, baby? She stopped, and I turned around to face her. Well, I guess for the way I spoke to you earlier, but I feel like I have something more to apologize for. If I could just figure out exactly what it is, I'd feel a lot happier. The truth is, kid, you're the one who should be apologizing. You and I are the victims. All we have to do now is make up for lost time, I replied. You don't look very angry, father. I've had many years to realize that anger doesn't make things better, Tamsin. What it can do, though, is get you in very deep trouble. Believe me, I've been through this before. But Grandma, your grandmother never loved me, Tamsin, ever since your mom and I started courting. But why? What did you do to upset her? I was born on the side your grandmother considers wrong, Tamsin, and I courted her daughter. Snobbery, plain and simple. Will I like my father looking over my shoulder? I hope so, kiddo, but I won't be able to be around all the time. Remember, most of my work involves Antarctica. I'm there most of the year. Somehow, I don't think my Aunt Megan is going to like this. She seems to have a bit of a crush on you. What happened to her husband? I think she got married, I asked. Okay, that's not true. Megan hinted that she was married. I just wanted to get a little history without asking her. Tamsin chuckled. Oh, yes, that's right. He was a handsome fellow too, but a little too skilled with his fists. What do you mean? They were arguing about something, and he hit Megan. God, what has she done? Dad, do you remember Aunt Megan telling you how she was bullied at school? Yeah, that's right. I took her to the gym and taught her how to defend herself. Megan's ex-husband felt the effects of your instructions. He was taken away in an ambulance. Shit, did Megan get hurt? With Uncle Bertie on the case, her ex got 2 years probation. Well, that's good to know. I'd hate to be the cause of strife in Megan's life. She was a good kid. Do you like my Aunt Megan, father? I can see she's partial to you. I always liked Megan, Tamsin, but she was your mother's younger sister, who was my fiancée and then my wife. You have to control your emotions under those circumstances. Uncle Bertie like wisdom, father. Well said. From now on, you're my daddy, okay? I don't mind, kid. Tamsin wrapped her arms around my neck, pulled me close, and kissed my cheek. I'll enjoy hearing my nickname Kiddo every time you say it, Daddy. But as I was saying, or rather trying to say, my mom is dead, my dad and Aunt Megan. Well, I always liked my Aunt Megan. May I assume a sort of seal of approval, Tamsin? I asked. You bet, Dad. Go after her. Don't jump to conclusions, Tamsin. Megan is recalling her older brother's character, not her lover. The two are not necessarily interchangeable. Uncle Bertie has spoken again. Let's go back to the house. I want to brag about Daddy to all my friends. What about your new husband? Paul left me to myself on a cruise ship for 2 weeks. He has nothing to complain about. We returned to the house, and I was introduced to what seemed like hundreds of young people. I didn't notice Megan, who I hoped would save me, but eventually Bertie appeared beside me. Tamsin seemed a little reluctant, but finally agreed that I could go out for a walk with Bertie. In fact, from what I gather, Bertie needed a cover when he slipped outside for a cigar. Apparently, Bertie's very quiet wife does not approve of his smoking. We went out to the patio, and Bertie lit a cigar. You do realize that I would never make Shauna sit through this, don't you, William? He said. Bertie, I may be silly, but I'm not stupid. She really was something special, wasn't she? Yes, she was, and she was terribly afraid of going to prison, especially an American prison. I wonder, would have sent her to prison for perjury. She must have hit her head pretty hard to break her cheekbone like that. In an English court, I have my doubts, but in an American court, I have no idea. Hyacinth frightened Shauna that she would be sent to prison anyway, and Shauna witnessed your railroad trial. I read the transcript, William. It was small-town justice that left a lot to be desired. A decent appeal wouldn't hurt you. Bertie, by the time I'd sorted it out, I should have been released anyway. An appeal filed then would have gotten Shauna to go in the opposite direction, especially since Larry Parker was dead. You know better than anyone how some legal moguls look at things when they find out they've been cheated. Some bastard's gotta pay. You're a sentimental fool, William. Hark who speaks, I replied. Albert took one last puff of his cigar and crushed it against the balustrade. Don't mention this to Memsahib, William, or I'll be castrated. Now we'd better get back inside before Megan goes on another rampage. That girl has a thing for you, young man. I've noticed, Bertie, I've noticed. Capital, capital, he replied as we returned to the function room. It wasn't until Tamsin and Paul disappeared into the hotel honeymoon suite that I realized I didn't have a reservation for that evening. The original plan had been for me to return to the rented cottage on the south coast that I called home. Don't worry, I have a spare bed in my room. You can use it. Megan, aren't you rushing things a little too fast? You know you have to rush things. Hey, watch it, stud. I've seen you in action, and I want it to be the same this time. What do you mean you've seen me in action? You said it yourself, Billy. I'm particularly good at sneaking around, and I've sneaked up on some people more than once and watched them. Your little hideout in the woods turned out not to be as big a secret as you and Shauna thought. Damn it, you're a pervert, Megan. You want to see perversion? I'll show you perversion. Let's go to my room. I woke up to the feeling of an unfamiliar heaviness on my chest. When I opened my eyes and looked at my chest, I saw Megan's face smiling back at me. Already recovered, she asked. Damn, girl, you don't do things by halves, do you? I only had one night to make sure you understood what you were being offered on a regular basis. Is that some kind of offer, Megan? Of course, love, and I can get Father Connor here in no time to make it official if you'll let me. Father Connor is a Roman Catholic, Megan, and we're both from the Church of England, aren't we? Details, details, details. I thought you were a sailor, Billy? Yes, but what does that have to do with the price of apples? Any port in a storm, lover. I'd marry a bleeding rabbi if you asked me to. Besides, I've got this. Megan held out an envelope for me to see. And please tell me what is in that envelope, Megan. 2 cruise tickets, an equally luxurious suite paid for by my old uncle. And it just so happens to be the same cruise where a certain man's daughter and her new husband will be spending their honeymoon. I can't always be around, kiddo. Remember, most of my work is in Antarctica. I'm there for a good part of the year. Tamsin sighed. Somehow, I don't think my Aunt Megan is going to like this. She does seem to have a bit of a crush on you, she said with a teasing smile. What happened to her husband? I think she got married, I asked, curiosity piqued. Okay, that's not entirely true. Megan hinted that she was married. I just wanted to get a bit of history without directly asking her. Tamsin chuckled. Oh yes, that's right. He was a handsome fellow too, but a little too skilled with his fists. What do you mean? They were arguing about something, and he hit Megan. God, what has she done? I asked, feeling a surge of protective anger. Dad, do you remember Aunt Megan telling you how she was bullied at school? Yeah, that's right. I took her to the gym and taught her how to defend herself. Megan's ex-husband felt the effects of your instructions. He was taken away in an ambulance. Shit, did Megan get hurt? Not really, thanks to Uncle Bertie. Her ex got 2 years probation. Well, that's good to know. I'd hate to be the cause of strife in Megan's life. She was a good kid. Tamsin looked at me with a knowing smile. Do you like my Aunt Megan, Father? I can see she's partial to you. I always liked Megan, Tamsin, but she was your mother's younger sister, who was my fiancée and then my wife, remember? You have to control your emotions under those circumstances. Said it all very Uncle Bertie-like, Father. I chuckled. So I said it, and it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. From now on, you're my daddy, okay? I don't mind, kid. Tamsin wrapped her arms around my neck, pulled me close, and kissed my cheek. I'll enjoy hearing my nickname Kiddo every time you say it, Daddy. But as I was saying, or rather trying to say, my mom is dead, my dad and Aunt Megan. Well, I always liked my Aunt Megan. May I assume a sort of seal of approval, Tamsin? I asked with a grin. You bet, Dad. Go after her. Don't jump to conclusions, Tamsin. Megan is recalling her older brother's character, not her lover. The two are not necessarily interchangeable. Uncle Bertie has spoken again. Let's go back to the house. I want to brag about Daddy to all my friends. What about your new husband? Paul left me to myself on a cruise ship for 2 weeks. He has nothing to complain about. We returned to the house, and I was introduced to what seemed like hundreds of young people. I didn't notice Megan, who I hoped would save me, but eventually Bertie appeared beside me. Tamsin seemed a little reluctant, but finally agreed that I could go out for a walk with Bertie. In fact, from what I gather, Bertie needed a cover when he slipped outside for a cigar. Apparently, Bertie's very quiet wife does not approve of his smoking. We went out to the patio, and Bertie lit a cigar. You do realize that I would never make Shauna sit through this, don't you, William? he said. Bertie, I may be silly, but I'm not stupid. She really was something special, wasn't she? Yes, she was, and she was terribly afraid of going to prison, especially an American prison. I wonder, would they have sent her to prison for perjury? She must have hit her head pretty hard to break her cheekbone like that. In an English court I have my doubts, but in an American court I have no idea. Hyacinth frightened Shauna that she would be sent to prison anyway, and Shauna witnessed your railroad trial. I read the transcript, William. It was small-town justice that left a lot to be desired. A decent appeal wouldn't hurt you. Bertie, by the time I'd sorted it out, I should have been released anyway. An appeal filed then would have gotten Shauna to go in the opposite direction, especially since Larry Parker was dead. You know better than anyone how, some legal moguls look at things when they find out they've been cheated. Some bastard's gotta pay. You're a sentimental fool, William. Hark, who speaks? I replied with a grin. Albert took one last puff of his cigar and crushed it against the balustrade. Don't mention this to Memsahib, William, or I'll be castrated. Now we'd better get back inside before Megan goes on another rampage. That girl has a thing for you, young man. I've noticed, Bertie, I've noticed. Capital, capital, he replied as we returned to the function room. It wasn't until Tamsin and Paul disappeared into the hotel honeymoon suite that I realized I didn't have a reservation for that evening. The original plan had been for me to return to the rented cottage on the south coast that I called home. Don't worry, I have a spare bed in my room. You can use it, Megan said with a sly smile. Megan, aren't you rushing things a little too fast? You know you have to rush things. Hey, watch it, stud. I've seen you in action, and I want it to be the same this time. What do you mean you've seen me in action? You said it yourself, Billy. I'm particularly good at sneaking around, and I've sneaked up on some people more than once and watched them. Your little hideout in the woods turned out not to be as big a secret as you and Shauna thought. Damn it, you're a pervert, Megan. You want to see perversion? I'll show you perversion. Let's go to my room. I woke up to the feeling of an unfamiliar heaviness on my chest. When I opened my eyes and looked at my chest, I saw Megan's face smiling back at me. Already recovered? She asked. Damn, girl, you don't do things by halves, do you? I only had one night to make sure you understood what you were being offered on a regular basis. Is that some kind of offer, Megan? Of course, love, and I can get Father Connor here in no time to make it official if you'll let me. Father Connor is a Roman Catholic, Megan, and we're both from the Church of England, aren't we? Details, details, details. I thought you were a sailor, Billy. Yes, but what does that have to do with the price of apples? Any port in a storm, lover. I'd marry a bleeding rabbi if you asked me to. Besides, I've got this. Megan held out an envelope for me to see. And please tell me what is in that envelope, Megan. 2 cruise tickets, an equally luxurious suite paid for by my old uncle. And it just so happens to be the same cruise where a certain man's daughter and her new husband will be spending their honeymoon. In an English court, I have my doubts, Albert said with a sigh, puffing on his cigar. But in an American court, who knows? Hyacinth had Shauna terrified she'd be sent to prison anyway. And Shauna witnessed your railroad trial. I read the transcript, William. It was small-town justice that left a lot to be desired. A decent appeal wouldn't have hurt you. By the time I'd sorted it out, I should have been released anyway, I replied. An appeal filed then would have made Shauna go in the opposite direction, especially since Larry Parker was dead. You know better than anyone how some legal moguls look at things when they find out they've been cheated. Some bastard's gotta pay. You're a sentimental fool, William, Albert remarked with a wry smile. Hark, who speaks? I retorted playfully. Albert took one last puff of his cigar, crushed it against the balustrade, and chuckled. Don't mention this to Memsahib, William, or I'll be castrated. Now, we'd better get back inside before Megan goes on another rampage. That girl has a thing for you, young man. I've noticed, Bertie, I've noticed, I said, shaking my head. Capital, capital, he replied as we returned to the function room. It wasn't until Tamsin and Paul disappeared into the hotel honeymoon suite that I realized I didn't have a reservation for the evening. The original plan had been for me to return to the rented cottage on the south coast that I called home. Don't worry, I have a spare bed in my room. You can use it, Megan offered with a mischievous smile. Megan, aren't you rushing things a little too fast? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You know you have to rush things, she teased back. Hey, watch it, stud. I've seen you in action, and I want it to be the same this time. What do you mean you've seen me in action? I asked, puzzled. You said it yourself, Billy. I'm particularly good at sneaking around, and I've sneaked up on some people more than once and watched them. Your little hideout in the woods turned out not to be as big a secret as you and Shauna thought. Damn it, you're a pervert, Megan, I exclaimed. You want to see perversion? I'll show you perversion. Let's go to my room, she said with a wink. I woke up to the feeling of an unfamiliar heaviness on my chest. When I opened my eyes and looked down, I saw Megan's smiling face. Already recovered? She asked with a grin. Damn, girl, you don't do things by halves, do you? I only had one night to make sure you understood what you were being offered on a regular basis, she replied. Is that some kind of offer, Megan? I asked. Of course, love, and I can get Father Connor here in no time to make it official if you'll let me. Father Connor is a Roman Catholic, Megan, and we're both from the Church of England, aren't we? Details, details, details. I thought you were a sailor, Billy. Yes, but what does that have to do with the price of apples? Any port in a storm, lover. I'd marry a bleeding rabbi if you asked me to. Besides, I've got this. Megan held out an envelope for me to see. And please tell me what is in that envelope, Megan. 2 cruise tickets and an equally luxurious suite paid for by my old uncle. And it just so happens to be the same cruise where a certain man's daughter and her new husband will be spending their honeymoon. Great, you'll see your daughter during the day, and we can have sex every night of the week. Megan, when did you and good old Bertie start planning this Shanghai exercise, or whatever you call it? To be completely honest with you, Billy, the basic plan Bertie came up with after Shauna's funeral. Of course, my Uncle Bertie didn't envisage me seducing you. That was entirely my idea and fell under the heading of a preferred outcome. So, what do you think of this cruise? I asked, looking at the wistful expression on Megan's face. I think I shall enjoy my vacation, my dear. However, we won't have time to get a marriage license before the ship sails. Don't worry, Billy. I checked. It's registered in Bermuda. And what does that mean exactly? You'll find out soon enough, hubby. You'll find out, Megan grinned. Now, how do you fancy another walk on the deck before breakfast? We only had time for breakfast that morning. Life goes on. Epilogue. Megan and I didn't get married on the ship. Though we were fine with it, Bertie's wife didn't want to rush things. For such an outwardly modest old lady, Beatrice could be very bossy when she wanted to be. Not surprising, considering who exactly she had been married to for so long. Beatrice organized our marriage. I'm sure it was all paid for by Bertie himself. Of course, it wasn't as lavish as Tamsin's, but neither Megan nor I wanted it to be. Frankly, we'd both prefer a private affair aboard the ship with Tamsin and Paul as witnesses. The witch didn't attend our wedding, but Megan's father gave her away in marriage. He even said, "This is getting to be a habit, William," as he handed me his daughter's hand. Bertie went through the whole day with a huge grin on his face. During his speech, he even claimed that he was responsible for bringing the bride and groom together. Which I suppose he was, pretty much. Although I believe Megan's determination would have eventually brought us together some other way if I hadn't snuck into Tamsin's wedding. My wife, when she knows what she wants, seems able to move mountains to get it. She can certainly bend Uncle Bertie to her will, and that's not so hard. Her only problem is that Megan spends a lot of time thinking, like, are we getting up now, or do we just hang out on the deck a little longer first? This, I assure you, is wreaking havoc on my work schedule, and it's not too good for my back. I'm not as young as I used to be. And it doesn't matter if my wife wants to believe otherwise. Yes, but I don't work in the South Seas anymore. Bertie knew someone who was acquainted with someone whose brother is a commissioned producer, or something like that, in the BBC Wildlife Department. I unexpectedly found Megan's phone hyped up with offers for wildlife shoots, mostly in the UK and all moderately lucrative. All in all, just right for me. Megan and I have decided that having kids is not an issue. We feel like with the Tamsin twins, we'll have our plate full of worries. That's assuming she and Paul don't play soccer. We settled into a quaint little bungalow around the corner from Paul and Tamsin's house, a convenient distance for pushing a stroller. And Bertie pushed Paul and I to the local golf club. Our Sunday mornings with the four of us became a regular occurrence. The fourth contestant, George, of course. Now that he and the witch are no longer husband and wife, he has been elevated or restored to the position of second grandfather in my daughter's eyes. Bertie, of course, takes precedence. Well, since he's the patriarch of the family, what do you expect? Life goes on.